Ross, thank you. Will, thank you. It's good to be here, and it's fun to have a little bit of competition for Shark Tank. I was going to talk just very quickly about 3 Arctic transportation frontiers, but before I get to that, and really as part of a keynote, I want to talk a little bit about this part of the world where we live. There are 8 Arctic nations, the United States with Alaska, Canada, Iceland, Greenland with Denmark with Greenland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. And this part of the world never really got together until the Cold War ended. And there were, thank you, and there were a lot of things that we should talk about, a lot of things that we did talk about. But I'll tell you, having been in Governor Wally Hickle's cabinet at the time we began Arctic cooperation, that was 1990, and it was really not until about 1998 or 99 that we could get the Arctic nations to talk about economic cooperation. It was environmental cooperation to begin with, person-to-person issues, all very, very important things. But the question of, is this an area with an economic interest, an economic neighborhood, is for me been one of the unsolved mysteries of the Arctic. I had helped start tourism between the United States and Russia. That's a whole startup company where we brought 5,000 people as high-paying tourists, paying $5,000 to $10,000 a piece to the Bering Sea area, to Wrangel Island, and yet the Russians really made it very, very hard to be a sustainable business. I know people in Alaska who started mines, who found billion-dollar mines over there. It made it hard to make it a sustainable business. Someday this will be a neighborhood with a sustainable business, circumpolar, and it's beginning to happen several different ways. First thing I want to say is that in the Arctic we feed the world. We help produce fish in tremendous quantities, certainly in the North Pacific and the Bering Sea area, as well as in the Barents Sea. We help fuel the world, and we all know what we do in terms of oil and gas, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But most people don't know that most of the silver produced in America is produced in Alaska. Most of the silver produced in Alaska goes into solar cells, not into silverware or your mother's tea set. Most of the graphite that should be used in the upcoming wave of electric cars could be produced in Northwest Alaska. It's a very exciting prospect and opportunity. Toward that end, we provision the world with the largest lead zinc mine in Alaska, largest nickel mine in Norilsk, largest iron ore mine going in Baffin Island. We are soon, I believe, to see in the Northwest Territories the largest cobalt mine. A lot of this is driven by the electric car wave that is coming along. We protect the world, and we had a big fight here in Alaska to get missile defense. But Billy Mitchell said it many years ago that we are in a strategic position, and we certainly have a lot to do there. It's us, it's Greenland's radar working for us, it's NATO and Norway, it's our partnership in Canada, but the Russians see themselves in a similar important position, and sometimes we're in a friendly relationship, sometimes we're not. We connect the world, and we'll talk about that mostly in transportation, but also in telecommunications in a number of different ways, quite significantly. Finally, we help inspire the world. And I want to say our 10,000-year-old culture is important, but it's also just a tremendous natural beauty and an interest that many, many people have in coming here. Why these 6 things in a transportation talk? It's important to have it in a transportation talk because all of these things require transportation. And all of them have set us in the position of being innovative in transportation, and we will be innovative in transportation coming forward. So I want to talk about 3 frontiers right now, just that we're working on that I think Alaskans should pay attention to. First and foremost, and most of my talk will be on the newly accessible ocean. How many times in human history does the world give you a new ocean? And that's happening to us right now. The second is we are playing catch-up in the north, and catch-up is certainly across Eurasia in the concept of transcontinental and even intercontinental railroads. And Governor Hickle used to say about the intercontinental railroads, it may not happen in my lifetime, but we shouldn't stop talking about it. I will tell you that there are many drivers now that could actually make some of these things happen. The third thing that I just want to mention in terms of transportation is that transportation requires energy, and we all know that. there are a number of things happening in energy technology that I think Alaskans should pay very close attention to for two reasons. One, some of the new technologies could literally pull the rug out from under our economy. That doesn't mean ignore them. You know, if you made Jell-O and that was your main dessert and somebody invented Whip and Chill, General Foods decided to put out Whip and Chill so that they, even though it would cannibalize Jell-O, it would have it. You know, you got they had two kinds of decaffeinated coffee in the beginning, and they were made by the same company in the same plant. You have to address all of the markets. The second reason why I think it's very important to pay attention to these tech changes in the energy business is pure and simple. It's going to make much of Alaska's challenges less challenging. The cost of high power costs across the state and so forth. So these are three frontiers I want to touch on. And let me just start with shipping and this new ocean. In 2006, I was chairman of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and it was the first time that the majority of ice, the first time in human history, that the majority of multi-year ice left the Arctic Ocean. It flowed out through the Fram Strait east of Greenland, and all of a sudden, the ice regime became really an annual ice regime in the Arctic. As chair of the commission, I helped write this book. I actually paid a couple of $1 million to get this book written. And I jokingly have given copies to, libraries like this one with, which will keep their Captain Cook voyages and their other voyages of people trying to find the Northwest Passage. In this book, 8 nations negotiated word for word. And it's the first time the 8 nations at the top of the world said, how are we going to make this new ocean work? And this was the blueprint for Arctic marine shipping and safety. It was a safety agenda set in 2009. We did adopt a mandatory polar code. I'm not going to go into it except to say, if you're going into the Arctic Ocean, it's probably nice to have a lifeboat that's heated. There are many other rules that came along as part of the polar code, cleaner fuels, making sure you had ice monitoring, ice staffing, good plans, all of which mean a lot ultimately to the economy of Alaska. I have been working for the last few years now on what I call a business plan for a new ocean. And I've been doing that as part of the Arctic Circle in Fairbanks. And you just gave me a 1 minute. I thought I had 20. Have I taken 20? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. That's all right, Laura. Thank you. All right. So at any rate, Arctic shipping, we have been working on a business plan. And the concept is to take a look at some international cooperation model that could bring us together to offer services. The St. Lawrence Seaway is a good one. If you're a ship from any nation, you can enter the St. Lawrence Seaway. You cross the U.S.-Canada border 23 different times, but there's one number to call. And we could do parallel legislation on this that we drafted with the Alaska delegation. We need to come up with a revenue model to support icebreakers. We're battling for money in the federal budget for icebreakers, and why should American taxpayers pay so that France can buy goods from China more easily? We shouldn't. We should be in a revenue model like the Russians have set up to try to help support those icebreakers, the navigational aids, the ports, and so forth. So the idea has been to get the resources necessary for the use of the Arctic Ocean, get the deep water ports. This is probably the best deep water port in the American Arctic at Port Clarence, north of Nome, and get the infrastructure in place. Now, why should we do that? This is a study done by the Russians where they hired an international group, kind of like McKinsey, and they looked very closely at the international market for shipping. And you can find that on our website for the Arctic Circle's shipping thing, which I can give you after this talk. But essentially what they said is 18,000 ships go through the Suez Canal every year. They looked at city pairs and said for about 10% of that shipping, the Arctic route is clearly competitive. That's 1,800 vessels a year, or at the Russian current tariff, about $900 million. So let me ask this question. Bill, you're going to talk next. Your Anchorage Economic Development, you and your predecessors have worked hard to build up our airport as the 5th largest air cargo port in the world. What should we be doing to get some piece of this billion-dollar market of serving shipping that's coming along if the Arctic gets 10% of that. And I think one of the first things that we will do, the Russians had an idea of, okay, let's do a hub for container ships. That actually was an idea stolen from us, a study we did in 2006, surrounding infrastructure and 2 port hubs. So they basically said they can capture this revenue for a $2 billion a year market with about a $2 billion investment, and they're working on that. We need to figure out what our role is in that. I'm going to talk about what I think is going to actually drive that for us, and that's going to be liquefied natural gas. Shipping in the Arctic is growing very quickly because natural gas is growing very quickly. The amount of natural gas used in the world today is about 30 billion cubic feet a day. Governor Walker and AK LNG are trying to put 3 billion on that market. It's a 10% market share immediately. All right. The Russians have just put 16.5 million tons on the market on a new technology, a double-acting tankers. They've bought 14 of them. There will be 28 tanker transits a month through the Bering Strait by this time next year, when all those tankers are completed, carrying 16.5 million tons. Vladimir Putin punched the button on this. You know, when you hear Putin punching a button, that's, I guess, a question. But the point is, it was launched in December of last year. 16.5 million tons is what they're taking through the Bering Strait. And they announced a plan with Korea signing on as the anchor customer to up that 16 to over 55 million tons by the end of the next decade. They are clearly in the race and we're not. And so the question for us is, if they can do this through the Bering Strait, what should we be doing? And the question is, should we be looking at LNG directly to Asia? Now, I will tell you, we've got plenty of gas opportunity to keep the supply needed for AK LNG and to experiment with this, and we've been urging publicly that Alaska get on top of this. I'll also say that the Canadians have now called a meeting next month to look at this with their gas suppliers to see what you have, and it could be that we could cooperate on icebreakers if it happens. Their long pipeline project to bring expensive natural gas from the Arctic to Canada, where natural gas is cheap, finally gave up the ghost earlier this year. And the fact is that you already have the Norwegian terminal north of the Arctic Circle, the Yamal terminal, the Verendey oil terminal that I've mentioned, and the idea of getting Arctic LNG happening would not be the first inside this Arctic region at all. So that is likely to be the driver for the growth in Arctic shipping. Arctic shipping is up 81% this year on the Northern Sea route because of LNG. So I would just have us think about that. Second thing I want to talk about very quickly is intercontinental railroads. I studied, and I apologize for putting Fort McMurray in Quebec here on that map to the left, but there are 3 to 4 projects right now trying to connect the Arctic to continental railroad systems. There's one that would leave Fort McMurray, Alberta, and connect with us in Delta Junction. There's one that's looking at coming into the port of Kirkenes, Norway, and going down to Rovaniemi and joining the European rail system. And then there's actually 2 links in Russia that are competing to be the rail link from the Northern Sea route into the European continent. This story from yesterday's paper basically looks at the Kirkenes proposal and how they're trying to bring that in with both shipping and rail links. And it's a race going on in Western Europe, and we're not paying very much attention to it, but the analog is very important to us. If you do get a port here, a rail connection to here, our port in Anchorage and Port McKenzie is 2 to 4 days shorter than any other Asia to North American trip. So if you're making something someplace, bringing it in here would be significant. I had a client when I was at PT Capital called A2A Railroad. They've spent close to $30 million developing this concept so far, and that's on top of a study done by the Van Horn Institute, paid for by the government of Alberta. The interesting driver in this, besides what it would do to create the ports, is bringing bitumen, or about 1.5 million barrels a day of solid oil from the tar sands in Alberta to a tidewater market where we are actually much cheaper than going over the mountains to British Columbia. So that's the concept and the driver that could actually link us to North America right now. The concept is interesting to talk about, because here I've talked about the future of Arctic shipping with an anchor tenant in LNG. I've talked about the future of a rail connection with an anchor tenant in bitumen. And I want to leave you with this, is that there are cleaner transportation fuels coming. If you just thought tech wasn't going to change, the Arctic is obviously huge with oil and gas potential. This study done by the USGS about 10 years ago, while I was chair of the Arctic Research Commission, we pushed that. And Arctic oil to be found is approximately 13% of world resources. Our natural gas in the north is 30% of the undiscovered conventional natural gas in the world. We will be playing in natural gas markets for a long time to come, or will we? And I think that's one question. I mentioned earlier the Graphite 1 project, which you can see down there just near Port Clarence, where they would be shipping graphite out of Port Clarence or Nome, and we would hope processing it here if they could find inexpensive enough power to do that. It's a significant number of jobs for Alaska. That's part of the electric car market coming along. There are new decarbonization options. One that I've been following is called a company called Hazer in Australia, where if you piped natural gas in, say, that part of the room, this room were filled with warm iron ore, you're piping pure hydrogen out the other side of the room, and fluffy graphite comes to the floor. In other words, there's new catalysts, new technologies coming along that will decarbonize gas even before you use it. That could actually keep us in the natural gas business for a long time, and it's worth Alaska paying attention to that. Another option that is coming along is a study being done by the Japanese with the Australians that would decarbonize coal. And again, go directly to hydrogen and ship hydrogen. And they've taken the worst coal in Australia to develop this process. So it's important to watch that decarbonization going along. A third, and this is a real black swan, but it's a company I've been talking to some, visited them at the Kennedy Space Center. It's a company that has found a catalyst that can remove hydrogen from seawater. The salt in the seawater is part of the catalyst, where 1 watt of power coming in gives you about 7 watts thermal equivalent of hydrogen coming out. And that's the pull the rug out from under our economy technology that I think we have to pay attention to. I think it's very important that we understand that one way or the other, we need to be part of decarbonization, even as we have an economy that's very dependent on selling carbon fuels. And we've got to be paying very close attention to here. You get something like this that would make energy very, very inexpensive in the bush. It would make it very easy for Bill to say, please put your graphite refining plant here. We can give you 4-cent power. And at the other hand, it's something that might make some of the other things happening in conventional fuels a little bit more difficult. I guess I would say pay attention to all these things. There's some other things going on in power transmission that are significant, that can be huge opportunities for us and huge challenges for us. With that, what I really want to do is just conclude by saying this. We do have a new accessible ocean, and this is a huge frontier opportunity for Alaska, and we need to pay attention to it. And it's one of those billion-dollar drivers where we should get significant market share. We do have an opportunity with a driver now that might be able to pay for a rail link to Alaska that would make us potentially one of the biggest ports on the West Coast. And we do have new technology coming along that we have to pay close attention to because it will change the way we transport. I would love to have talked about drones, but we have a drone expert coming up. I would have loved to talk about airships, but I didn't have time. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.